Oh, thank you, Sally, for that very kind introduction. I'd like to thank the organisers for encouraging me to speak, because otherwise I wouldn't be here, as surely I would never have got my act together in time to secure one of these precious tickets. So I'm very glad to be here participating in what is turning out to be a most stimulating and exciting gathering. So thank you very much. I hope I'm audible, not only in here, but to you in the cheap seats. Can you hear me? Good. I'll try and keep close to the microphone. Well, it seemed to me that the intention of the conference was to shift the perspective on perhaps familiar aspects of early medieval Scotland. So this seemed an ideal opportunity to take something that we think of as unique to Scotland and try to widen the focus and look at it in a European perspective. I speak, of course, of our beloved symbol stones, Pictish glass one symbol stones. Now, the risk of appearing well on in the programme is that earlier speakers will have stolen your thunder or blown apart your argument. I'm happy to say that neither of those seems to have happened, although already a number of speakers have touched on themes that I too am going to be talking about, which has really cheered me, because there was no previous conferring, and yet coming from very different perspectives, similar things are coming out again and again, which I think is very interesting. I'm going to present to you some sort of big ideas. I don't really have time for detail, and when I went back yesterday and read my abstract, my very aspirational abstract, I thought, gosh, I need a whole Rhines weekend's worth of lectures to actually do that. So I'm going to be skating very fast over lots of big things. I'm very happy to be drawn on the detail, because there is detailed thinking behind these things, both by me and by a number of other scholars. So I'm happy to be drawn in discussions. Well, symbol stones. The symbols inscribed on symbol stones are indeed unique to Scotland, but it's my contention that they are inscribed on a type of monument which is somewhat more widespread. And this is not my argument alone. In other parts of the Celtic-speaking Britain and Ireland, we also have unshaped natural pillars incised with graphic marks and erected in landscape contexts. Now, in the Gaelic-speaking areas, these graphic marks take the form of short formulaic inscriptions in the Oakum Alphabet. This is a script that was invented during the Roman period at some point to represent the sounds of the Irish or Gaelic language. It's well suited for carving on wood. Contrary to what you will see in books, it is very unsuited to carving on stone. But carve it on stone they did start doing after the alphabet was already old by a century or more. So in the 4th and 5th century, we begin to see it carved on tall pillars of very similar size and shapes to Pictish symbol stones. Like symbol stones, they sometimes appear singly, sometimes in clusters, although in Ireland the clusters can be somewhat larger, up to, I think, 15 from a single site, although that's unusual. As you can see from this map, they're known throughout the whole of Ireland, although they're unevenly distributed within the island. Oakum inscribed stones are also found in areas of Irish settlement in Western Britain, sometimes alongside a bilingual text in Latin. The Britons, of course, had their own tradition of inscribed pillar, and Adrian touched on this briefly this morning, but it too is very heavily influenced by the Irish Oakum models. Some Oakum pillars are marked with crosses, but Christianity is not, to use Adrian's phrase, their biggest statement. Oakum was also adopted in Scotland. Indeed, I did my PhD on Scottish Oakum, but the details of all that needn't detain us. My basic point is that what we seem to have is a unitary phenomenon of a monument type, although the specific character of the graphic marks on each different kind is very different. But archaeologically, they're very similar in form and they're very similar in context. Now, Charles Thomas came up, he was one of the first people to write about this, and he came up with the label for this class, individual inscribed memorials. I'm not particularly keen on that, A, because it's rather a mouthful, and B, because it prejudging the function of these monuments. And I'm happier with something like pillar stones. I'd be happy to call them Oakum inscribed pillar stones, symbol inscribed pillar stones, and whatever, but that's maybe something we can discuss. These different monuments are alike one another and very unlike contemporary funerary monuments elsewhere in Europe within the former Roman Empire, unlike them both in their physical form and in their landscape setting. I've already written about this, so I won't say any more. Now, if you cast your mind back to Martin's paper, you might remember a big map that had Europe divided up into zones, and there was a cult centre zone and a monumental mound zone and a standing stone zone, which was lightly coloured and covered the sort of western area. If you looked very, very closely, you will have seen that, in fact, far to the east, there was, in fact, another standing stone zone, although he coloured it a different colour, cunningly concealing the fact. I want to sort of change them all to being the same colour because I want to look at a phenomenon which I think is related, the phenomenon of the so-called picture stone, or in Swedish, the bildsten. These are all similar types of monument found beyond the limits of the former empire, in a sort of barbarian arc, if you like. And these bildsten are very geographically restricted. They're found only on the island of Gotland, which is a small island, about 18 miles in length, 90 kilometres from Swedish mainland, and about 130 kilometres from Latvia, so right in the middle of the Baltic. It has been subject to Sweden since the 9th century. It's not particularly blessed with natural resources, but it is superbly blessed by its strategic location as the sort of entrepot of the Baltic. And the island has at various points in its history been extremely wealthy because of its nodal point on trade links. And if you remember any of Matt Marika, it was there as well. So, and just as an indication of that, hordes, Viking period hordes from Gotland, preserve more Arab silver than the whole of the Arab world put together. So the people on Gotland were very wealthy, and this wealth is reflected in sculpture. There are over 570 pieces surviving, which is a remarkable quantity of sculpture for an area which is half the size of Aberdeenshire. The typology and dating of these is complicated. Basically, the tradition starts in the 5th century. There are both tall and short versions of the monuments, and the small ones, the dwarf stones, are erected more or less continuously until the 11th century. So you've got basically a 700-year tradition of erecting stones. The tall stones are there at the beginning in the 5th century, and then they stop, and there's a clear gap before they restart after a hiatus in the Viking Age, and they continue through to the end. So in a way, we've got a kind of class 1, class 2 situation, a gap within a renewed tradition, but the older ones are still there visible in the landscape, and the later ones have to be seen as being in dialogue with them. The carving on these, on the limestone stone, is very, very fine, very shallow, delicate incisions, and they've been painted in by the great scholar of the bildsten, Sune Lindqvist. It's his workings that you see still on the stones today. So just to give you an example, I can't do justice to the whole tradition, but I want particularly to look at the earliest ones because I think they're helpful for understanding the picture stones. Like picture symbol stones, bildsten spring fully formed. There is no experimental phase. They have a very distinctive shape. The limestone facilitates very tall, thin slabs, and the tallest are over 3 meters. And they're very narrow, they have convex tops. Each one is unique, but they have a standard layout, and although the elements vary, they're quite sort of formulaic in a way. They have a geometric frame. At the top is always a large circular solar motif, a whirl, often surrounded by a threatening monster, serpent, dragon. Below that, below the sun, is always a paired motif, which is interpreted as a solar motif. Sometimes snakes, sometimes horses, sometimes twins. This is all to do with Norse mythology. And these relate to solar cult imagery going back as early as the Bronze Age. And it's all to do with transformation and with death. At the bottom is often a ship, not under sail but being rowed. This is the ship of the dead, transporting the deceased person to the west, to hell, to the realm of the dead. This is a completely new monument form, but it's drawing on very ancient iconography. And I think, just as the Oakum stones were a new type of monument using an existing graphic system, this makes me think and makes me wonder if the Pictish symbols were likely, as a system, were likely to have been invented specifically to use on the stones, or, as I think more likely, were an existing system that already had resonance. Oakum inscriptions, we can read them, they're people's names, sometimes they're sort of kindred names. I happen to think that Pictish symbols probably do the same thing, that they name individuals in some way or identify individuals in some way. I acknowledge that that's open to a great deal of discussion. But I think one thing about the Oagums and the Pictish stones is that they are person-sized and kind of person-shaped. I think the symbol stones and the Oakum, the pillar stones, if you like, in a way represent the person in a way that I don't think the Swedish picture stones do. The themes on the picture stones are cosmological rather than personal, although they are certainly connected with the individuals because they mark graves. Sometimes, as Adrian says, not literally but symbolically. Sometimes they are actually over a grave and their roots have been excavated, and sometimes they're nearby within a cemetery. They can be part of complex funerary structures. None of them have survived intact in their original location, although I say they do have roots sometimes surviving. So you can see here we've got the stone over a cairn with curbs, shaped stone curbs, and associated with these sort of capstone graves as well. The tall type A stones are erected for a short period and then stop. The small stones continue, and interestingly their iconography evolves, and we can trace within it a shift in the iconography which mirrors the shift in Scandinavian religion that appears to have been taking place in the 6th century. The old solar cults are losing prominence at the expense of the emergence of the icy cults, the cults of Odin and Thor and so on. There is also towards the end a change in shape, as you can see this sort of domed mushroom shape, which some people see as phallic. Other explanations are available. There's a major change at the beginning of the Viking Age, when we start again getting tall stones in this mushroom shape. The imagery is new, it's male dominated. There are lots of people on these stones. They are aggressive or assertive images, mounted warriors, ships, but ships under sail and full of warriors, although the ships are still at the bottom just as they were on the old stones. These later stones are very famous, they're much illustrated, they have scenes, complex scenes from Norse mythology, familiar through the later Icelandic literature. The dwarf versions continue to be made, and these ones are consistently associated with burial. That's quite unambiguous throughout the whole period. And there's a subgroup of these marked here, which is distinctively shaped kist stones, which have been excavated in situ at graves. Now, the relationship between these different aspects of funerary architecture is complicated and not fully understood. These are different types found from the same place, Butle Inge, on Gotland. We have the kist, but we also have these tall stones aligned by a road, by the ruins of a big old house, long abandoned, but still obviously significant. They stand on the border between the enge, between the meadow or the pasture, a really important aspect of Gotlandic agriculture, between that and the forest, the thick forest which covers much of the island. This is a liminal geographical position, but it also has a cosmic liminality as well. And this is something which has been drawn on by Professor Anders Andrén, who's written very interestingly about the Bildstein phenomenon. And he suggested that the distinctive shape, forget mushrooms, forget palaces, forget whatever, he would see them as doors. And it's a very developed argument, which I don't have time for now, but it's nonetheless very interesting. And I'd always thought of Pictish cross slabs as like pages from a gospel book, but I now begin to think, well, maybe I could see them as doors to other worlds. something to think about. Anyway, the final stage of this monument tradition, the 11th century, is in the period when Gotlanders are converting and have converted to Christianity. The old imagery is completely dropped, and instead we have runic inscriptions and crosses of types just like contemporary rune stones on the mainland. They have, however, kept the traditional shape. And this, I think, is really important because it shows the repeated renewal of tradition and that these monuments are not tied to a particular religion, whether it's a phase within pagan religion or even that great shift from paganism to Christianity. About a half of all surviving picture stones are found at churches, often built into the fabric, and this is not, they're not just being reused as handy rubble. They're placed visibly, so they're placed with the carvings visible at significant locations. And these are early churches. These are 12th century churches. This is not antiquarian gathering in. So the reason that they're so frequently found at churches is because the stones were sited in old ancestral cemeteries, and those were the sites that were chosen for the building of the churches. This has been shown by excavation and also by the survival of other funerary stones kicking around churchyards and so on that were not incorporated into later structures. And with this in mind, I think it's worth looking at the distribution of the earliest monuments, these Type A ones. They stood in cemeteries, and I'm really struck looking at this distribution map, that they are more or less one per parish, and yet we're talking about monuments that were erected 500-600 years or more before the advent of Christianity, and shows that the potential relationship between medieval parishes and much older secular territorial units of the 6th or 7th century. And this is something that's coming out in work on Ireland. If we look at the correlation between names of baronies, a small territorial unit, and the kindreds named on the Oakum stones, there are correlations, suggesting that these stones were very successful in performing a role in the process of establishing the sort of territorialization of power and establishing power structures that endured through to the medieval period. And I'd maybe mention work currently done by my student Cynthia Thickpenny, showing similar kind of patterns in Scotland between symbol stones and davos, which seems to be the building blocks of the medieval parishes. So half of them are found at stones. The next churches, the next biggest group are associated with burials that are not cemeteries and burials that are not at churches. But they're also found at other locations too. For instance, I mentioned beside roads, and this seems to be very important. These ones are called blind stones because there's no carving on them, and probably because they were originally carved, but it's all been lost. So I think there's also kind of heritage management lessons to be learned from Gotland as well. This pattern of distribution is in a way also echoed when we look at the distribution of Oakum sites. Nearly half of the Oakum stones are also from church sites. Whether this is because they too were at cemeteries which subsequently became churches, or maybe the churches were already there. Some of the stones are definitely Christian, so it's possible. But it's interesting, Cathy Swift and others have argued that Oakum stones were introduced by Christians as a bulwark against pagans. Yet, for Pickland, David Clark and others have been recently arguing that symbol stones were introduced by pagans as a bulwark against Christians. And yet in Gotland, everyone was pagan, for hundreds of years, so Christianity doesn't come into it. And I think this is where the comparative approach is really helpful. They provide laboratories for testing explanations. Personally, I don't think any of them are primarily about religion, as Adrian put it. That's not their biggest statement. It comes into it, it's because it reflects prevailing religious beliefs. Another category, sizable category amongst the Oakum stones, is reused prehistoric standing stones. These are also prominent in Pickland symbol stones as well. And although I haven't done fine-tuned statistics, it is very striking to me that it's a roughly similar proportion of Oakum pillars and symbol stone pillars that appear to use reused standing stones, and I think that must be significant. This reuse of standing stones is it's not that common, and most prehistoric sanding stones don't get symbols put on them. But nonetheless, it's very widespread, which shows that it's an established custom. And I think it's probably because the stones happen to be at significant places already, and a lot of them seem to be connected with routeways. For instance, the example here from Nether Korsky, that's beside a major north-south route. But I think this relationship with prehistoric stones is really important. Too much to go into here, but all these areas that have these monuments, Western Britain and Gotland, they have. Oh yes, sorry, other point to make very quickly. There's a diversity of functions. We needn't assume that they're all exactly the same, and I know people are going to be talking tomorrow more about Rhynie, but here's an example that falls into none of the categories I've been talking about before. So we've got a great variety. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that all these areas have, at the time these stones were being erected, they already had stones in the landscape, visible in the landscape at very significant locations. So it seems to me that what you need is a pre-existing tradition of standing stones plus Roman influence or interest in Roman things. In Gotland, we see Roman influence in the form of luxury goods buried with a small proportion of elite graves in the 4th century. And these people are demonstrating wealth and access to these exotic goods, but they're relying on memory. These things are being put in the ground, they cease to be visible, so they rely on memory for that to be perpetuated. The picture stones seem to represent a different strategy. They reflect an awareness of Roman funerary architecture, but because they're erected above ground, they're visible for all eternity. They're less reliant on oral memory. What's interesting is that these graves exhibit either or. They either have grave goods or they have picture stones. They don't have both, and that's true on a cemetery level as well. And it just demonstrates the complexity of the reception of Roman ideas. They're not adopting a Roman package wholesale, but rather they're selecting elements and adapting them in ways that fit the local social environment. And I was thrilled when Cormac mentioned Kilpella as his very first slide, because I wanted to mention it too. This is a remarkable bit of evidence to show that in the 4th century, the Irish start erecting pillars after this huge gap of centuries and centuries and centuries. Only some of these pillars get Oakum, but again, they seem to be using an indigenous graphic system under influence from Rome. And there's increasing awareness of the strength and diversity of Roman influence in Ireland. We see it specifically in Latin names and in the Oakum inscriptions themselves. And Alice this morning talked about evidence for Roman influences coming into Pictland as well. 2 points I want to make just to sort of arising from this comparison. One regards the relationship between symbol stones and burial. There's been a number of recent publications that have expressed hyper-skepticism about the connection between symbol stones as burial. Yes, none are found absolutely in situ, but I feel that's it's unreasonable to expect that kind of preservation. And while we do have to be circumspect and we mustn't jump to conclusions, I do think that this argument has gone a bit too far. I'm no Taggart, but there are a series of smoking guns. These are by no means all the stones that appear to be connected with burial, but I think cumulatively these convince me that at least some and perhaps many picture symbol stones were indeed associated with graves. And again, Adrian's point about the cat stain, it symbolically rather than literally marks the grave. And the same is true of the Gotlandic material, which is understood to draw on funerary associations even when not directly over settlement. Ireland, I think, helps also with another aspect of picture studies, of picture symbol stone studies, this notion of multiple lives, and stones which have been reused in antiquity. Oakum stones, we have a few that have crosses added to Oakum, a few where the crosses added to Oakum and some where Oakum's added to crosses, some a handful, small handful, where the second Oakum inscription has been added to an inverted stone. So reuse is a phenomenon that is observable in both places, and again, interestingly, in a roughly similar proportion of examples. Now, David Clark has discussed this phenomenon in a sort of thinking outside the box article, which I find very challenging and stimulating, even if in the end I found myself not fully agreeing with all of his conclusions. But I think the evidence from Gotland shows that these stones can have had highly complex life stories. The Gotlandic material sometimes has been reused in lots of different ways in different locations. We have examples from the very early period of stones broken up within a generation or two, but not smashed for vandalism. They're transformed apparently into quern stones. So these big things were quarried. So a more widespread later phenomenon is picture stones broken up and placed in late Viking Age graves. Now, Clark has seen the Pictish reuse as a hostile act, a deliberate slighting of these earlier messages. And yet in Gotland, it seems to be the exact reverse. These are treated not with contempt, but they are cherished. The stones are valued as powerful objects which provide a tangible contact with a longed-for older order. These were reused by the last reactionary gasp of pagan people on a Gotland that was increasingly Christian. And again, the reuse in the Gotlandic church, contemptuous. And the reuse of Oakum stones and souterrains, I think they're placed at significant locations within the structure. And I think, again, it's not a purely or simply pragmatic reuse. They are recognised and cherished as significant stones with power. Examples of multiple lives from Pictish symbol stones. And the final point I want to make is about ethnicity in a way. As I said, there's 570 picture stones on Gotland and 4 from other places, from 3 sites. One is in Latvia, in a Vendel period grave, and the others are on the Swedish mainland in their late Viking period. These are, in fact, rune stones, but of picture stone shape. And one of these explicitly says it was brought from Gotland, which is borne out by the limestone geology of the slab. So these seem to be acquired by locals wanting to assert a connection with Gotland, and doing so through a characteristic piece of material culture that is seen as emblematic of that people. And I think this might help us come to grips with the outliers of Pictish symbols beyond Pictland. We have Pictish symbols at 3 hill forts outside Pictland. I've always been puzzled about this, but I've been working recently on Denad and also at Trustees Hill, and I'm coming to see these increasingly as something not imposed by the Picts, but rather something that local magnates were keen to assert a connection with Pictland and chose symbols to do so. I'm coming round to the idea that symbol stones are indeed a component of Pictish ethnogenesis, and I'm drawing here on work that James Fraser has been doing to emphasise that Pictishness is something that arises as a political idea in the 6th century, tied to the rise of Fortru. Now, Isabel Henderson's arguments about the northern origin of the symbol stones are as compelling now as they ever were, and in fact even more so now that we understand that Fortru is in fact in the north. I think the symbols are not something that's imposed by the Verturians on others, but rather is a badge of a club that lots of people wanted to join. So that's all I've got to say, but I hope you'll just indulge me 1 minute longer. I'm slightly embarrassed to do this, but I do feel in a professional rather than in a personal capacity, I have to thank Stephen Driscoll, who put me onto picture stones. For those of you who don't know, he's my husband. I read his writing. I'm obviously much younger than he is, I read his writings long before I ever met him. This is so romantic. But he's not only accompanied me on trips, or rather I've accompanied him, but anyway, he's done a lot to help develop my thinking on these matters. And I know he's also influenced Anders Andrén. And I think, it's not just about reading books about other places and getting other perspectives, it's about meeting other people. And it's been really great to hear from Mariaka, and I know from others to come. And so it's really, I think this is a great opportunity. And they say that travel broadens the mind. And I hope that our little trip to Sweden and to Ireland has helped broaden your perspectives on familiar material. Now, I'll just leave you where we started with our beautiful symbol stones, which I hope you perhaps now see with fresh eyes. Thank you very much.